everyone, and welcome back. If you are joining me for the first time, this is video 2 in my Deconstruction series. If you are returning and have watched the first video on biblical inerrancy and sola scriptura, welcome back. And this video is going to be covering Israelite origins. So, diving right in, before my deconstruction, one of the things that kept me firmly grounded in Christianity was the Old Testament narrative. Like most conservative Christians, I believed that Christianity had to be the one true religion, mainly because it was the only religion that had a historical narrative that was as elaborate as the Old Testament narrative is, and that was as ancient as the Old Testament narrative is, as it spans all the way to the creation of the universe. And with that, I understand that other ancient cultures and religions have their own versions of creation and the foundation of their people group and the development of their culture. But the way I saw it was that all of these narratives from these other cultures were merely myths, legends that were inaccurately trying to recall the true story or the true events that occurred. And those true events were, according to me, in my thinking, were rooted in the biblical text. So after I rejected biblical inerrancy and the authority of Scripture, I was able to allow myself to ask questions that I was really too afraid to ask before. And I decided to look at biblical history and archaeology more objectively, rather than trying to fit archaeology and history into the biblical narrative, which is kind of par for the course for most Christians, at least your more conservative evangelical Christians. And so really I set out, was determined to let the research stand on its own and speak for itself without any bias on my part. In my whole deconstruction process, I'm trying to remain as objective as possible. So with that, there are 3 major topics that I'm going to be covering in this video, and those are the Patriarchs, the Exodus, and the Conquest of Canaan. In my opinion, for whatever that's worth, the biblical account of the origins of the Israelites really hangs on these 3 events being historically true, factual, and verifiable extra-biblically. So outside of Scripture, we need to see some kind of historical record, be it textual, be it archeological, anthropological, and so those are the things that we're looking for. And so the way that I'm breaking this down, hopefully I've done it in a way that sort of makes sense to people. I'm starting with just the land of Canaan in general. So this region that we come to know as Canaan was known as the Levant and was called derivatives of the name of Canaan as early as around 3500 BCE. And the inhabitants of the Levant formed their own small kingdoms, such as those that are mentioned in the Old Testament, like the Amalekites and Jebusites and Amorites. We know that there was a people known as Israel, or a people group known as Israel, in the land of Canaan by the 13th century BCE. And we know this because of the victory stela of the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah. And the stela is appropriately named the Merneptah stela. And the stela makes references to his campaign in Canaan. And it simply states, "The Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt." So Merneptah reigned from 1213 to 1203 BCE. And so this tells us, more or less, that the Israelites came onto the scene somewhere between 3500 BCE, when we start hearing references to Canaan, and 1200 BCE, the first time Israel is mentioned historically outside of the Bible. And so with that, this is the oldest extra-biblical source for either an ancient people group or a nation called Israel. And I make that distinction because there is some debate as to whether Merneptah is referring to a people group known as Israel or referring to Israel as a nation or small city-state. And the general consensus, though, seems to be that the stela is referring to Israel as a people group, because the stela lists Canaanite cities specifically, and when it gets to Israel, it then distinctively refers to a people rather than a nation or city. So if Merneptah is referring to Israel as a people group, it would lead us to infer that the Israelites began kind of as a nomadic people, maybe like pastoralists or something like that. So there again, the 13th century on the Victory Stela is when Israel, more than likely as a people group, comes onto the historical scene outside of the Bible. And so this brings us to the Patriarchs. The Israelite narrative, to me, really begins with the Patriarchs, and I'm not overlooking the creation story, the flood, the Tower of Babel, all of that. I'm actually going to address all of those stories later in another video, but for those of you who didn't have a Judeo-Christian upbringing, the Patriarchs refer to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are considered the fathers of the Israelite nation. And how I want to get into the Patriarchs, I'm going to briefly touch on what the Bible says about Abraham, just to give us a point of reference. So looking at Genesis 12, verse 4, it says, "So Abraham departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh. At the time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'I will give this land to your descendants.' And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord. Then Abram continued traveling south by stages toward the Negev." And biblical scholars tend to place Abraham in Canaan around 2000 BCE. So that's the general time frame that we're looking at when we read this passage in the Bible. And so with that said, I want to now deviate from the textual narrative and really just look at what archaeology says, what anthropology says around this time period in the Patriarchs. So when researching the Patriarchs, we kind of have three primary texts or tablets that we can use. And those three texts are the Ugaritic, Mari, and Nuzi texts. And these really are the most significant archaeological discoveries that shed light on the stories of the Patriarchs, as well as on the development of Hebrew culture and history in general. Starting with the Mari texts, the value of the Mari texts for biblical studies lies in the fact that Mari is located in the vicinity of the homeland of the Patriarchs, being that it's about 200 miles southeast of Haran. So it shares a common culture with the area where the Patriarchs originated, or were said to have originated from. Some documents detail practices such as adoption and inheritance that are similar to those found in the Genesis accounts. The tablets speak of the slaughtering of animals, for example, when covenants were made. And the cities of Haran and Nahor in the upper Balik Valley, which are significant in the Bible as ancestral places where the patriarchs lived, are all documented as important dependent cities that were controlled by governors from Mari. And really the findings at Mari show that the patriarchal narrative actually does reflect the social, cultural conditions of that time and place. So a little bit about Mari in general. It was the capital of King Zimri-Lim in the 18th century BCE until it was conquered and destroyed by King Hammurabi in the late 20th century. And archaeologists discovered cuneiform tablets in Zimri Lim's former palace, and some of the tablets have been dated back 200 years before Zimri Lim's time, which would place them around the time that the Bible says Abraham's family departed Ur for the land of Canaan. And the Mari tablets offer information about political and cultural strife around Abraham's time that scholars think offer clues to their migration. And kind of the biblical scholarship notes that some of the Mari tablets use words from the Amorite tribes that are also found in Abram's story. And there have even been some scholars who suggest that Abraham's family may have actually been Amorites, which was a Semitic tribe that began to migrate out of Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE. All right, so moving on to the Nuzi tablets. Nuzi was a Hurrian administrative center not far from the Hurrian capital at Kirkuk in northern Iraq. The Hurrians are equivalent to the Horites in the Old Testament, which are also called Hivites and Jebusites, and excavations were carried out at Nuzi by American teams from 1925 to 1933, and the major find was more than 5,000 family and administrative archives that spanned 6 generations, dating from 1450 to 1350 BCE, and they deal by and large with social, economic, religious, legal institutions of the Hurrians. And like the Mari texts, the Nuzi tablets tell of practices similar to those in Genesis, such as adoption for childless couples, children by proxy, inheritance rights, marriage arrangements. They also demonstrate the significance of deathbed blessings and household gods. Some Nuzi tablets, called tablets of sistership, have agreements in which a man adopted a woman as a sister. In the Society of the Hurrians, for example, a wife enjoyed both greater protection and a superior position when she also had the legal status of a sister. And so in such a case, 2 separate documents were drawn up, one for marriage and the other for sistership. And this could explain why both Abraham and Isaac, his son, said that their wives were also their sisters, or that they were their sisters. It's possible that they had previously adopted them to give them higher status in accordance with customs of that day. Family records were also highly valued at Nuzi, being passed down from father to son for as many as 6 generations, and nowhere else in the ancient Near East is this kind of reverence for family documents illustrated, except really in the Old Testament. And indirectly, the practice at Nuzi supports the position that Genesis and the books of history in the Old Testament are grounded in actual family, clan, and tribal records carefully passed down from generation to generation. And as with Mari, the Nuzi records demonstrate that the cultural practices recorded in the books of Genesis are authentic to the time and place described. And then lastly, we have the Ugaritic texts. So in 1928, French archaeologists discovered a large collection of cuneiform tablets with a script unlike the previously discovered cuneiform writing. And this discovery was made at a site known as Ras Shamra near the Mediterranean coast in modern-day Syria. And the site was later discovered to be the ancient Canaanite city of Ugarit. It was later discovered that the Ugarit cuneiform was a phonogram or alphabet of sorts, where each cuneiform sign represented one letter of an alphabet. The Ugaritic alphabet was Semitic, and the Hebrew alphabet is Semitic. And some have called the writing system of Ugarit Hebrew cuneiform. And not only is the Ugarit alphabet Semitic, but the Ugarit language was also Semitic and almost identical to Hebrew. And this was a great discovery for biblical Hebrew scholars, as the Ugarit language was able to shed some light on some of the Hebrew words where the meaning is more uncertain. The city of Ugarit was occupied from prehistoric times to about 1200 BCE, when it was mysteriously deserted, and the tablets with the Ugarit cuneiform were written in its later life, about 1300 to 1200 BCE, and it was discovered through the writings of the tablets that the people of the city were worshippers of the Canaanite gods, the same Canaanite gods as their surrounding neighbors, including deities like El, Baal, Asherah, and even Yahweh. And the culture, lifestyles, and literary writings were found to be similar to the Israelites and can also shed some light on the biblical text. Okay, so now I want to look at what is called the Cave of Machpelah in relation to the Patriarchs. So the Cave of Machpelah, which according to Jewish tradition is said to be the tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. And it is considered to be the second holiest site other than the Temple Mount in Jewish tradition. But with that, there have not actually been any modern excavations or official excavations even, of this site. There was an entrance to the cave system that was discovered and reportedly explored in 1967, and it was reported that human remains were found, but whether they were the patriarchs or not, or the matriarchs, that would all be speculation. There are a lot of stories, legends, folk tales that span back as far as the Crusades, that claim they found remains of the patriarchs in the caves, but really until archaeologists are allowed to access the caves themselves, these again are just speculations. And so with all of that said, really that is all of the information that we have on the patriarchs themselves. Who we call the patriarchs, the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the stories around them can only be talked about from reading the text. There are no extra biblical accounts of the patriarchs themselves. But what the archaeological evidence does show us is that there are obvious parallels in the cultural details that we find in the patriarchal narratives and from what we know of the culture of the patriarchs of that time. But really the stories, the figures themselves and the things that happened or that they say happened in the text really has to be accepted by faith alone, and that's all you can really go on. That leads us now to Egypt, Moses, and the Exodus. So, the Exodus, perhaps the most famous Israelite story other than Noah's Ark. But I want to just say this right off the bat. There is no historical or archaeological evidence whatsoever for a group of people referred to as the Israelites having ever lived in Egypt. But if we could indulge the story for a little bit, the theories behind the dates of Exodus. So consensus among biblical scholars is that there are two primary dates vying for the true date of the Exodus. And those are 1265 BCE, which is referred to as the late date, and 1446 BCE, which is referred to as the early date. So starting with the late date for the Exodus, so 1265 BCE, this theory says that the Israelites arrive in the Promised Land around 1225 BCE, and we get this number because if we add 40 years of wandering, it gives us 1265 for the date of the Exodus. This puts the Israelites in Egypt under Pharaoh Ramses II, who reigned from 1279 to 1212 BCE. Ramses II, he built a lot of structures during his reign and was known to have utilized slavery for many of his building projects. And also, according to the biblical record, the Hebrews were settled in the land of Goshen to work on urban building projects in the cities of Pithom and Ramses. And the Bible further states that they were slaves in the land for 430 years, which puts Israel beginning its slavery around 1700 BCE. The issue with this idea, however, is that the Bible contradicts itself as to how long the Israelites were in Egypt. So Exodus 6:16 through 20 says that the Israelites were there for only 4 generations, and 4 generations would not equal 430 years. And it's also interesting to note that 430 is an ideal number. So track with me here for a second. 430 places the Exodus 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple. 480 is a multiple of 12, and 12 is significant in Jewish tradition. because in Judaism, the number 12 signifies a perfect governmental foundation, which makes it convenient and a little suspect. But anyway, we know that Semitic slaves were well attested to during the time of Ramses II, and there is a people group known as the Habiru who are known to have worked on Ramses' building projects. And at this point, I want to actually touch on the Habiru for a minute because there is a lot of biblical scholarship that tries to connect the Habiru to the Hebrews. The names obviously sound the same, but they're not the same people. So in the time of Rim-Sin, in 1822 BCE to 1763 BCE, the Sumerians knew a group of Aramean nomads living in southern Mesopotamia as Habiru. The word Habiru, Apiru occurs in hundreds of second millennium BCE documents covering a 600-year period from the 18th to the 12th century BCE, and it's found at sites ranging from Egypt to Canaan and Syria to Nuzi and Anatolia, which is Turkey. It's frequently used interchangeably with the word Sagasu, which is murderer or destroyer, and they appear to be composed of many different peoples, including nomadic Shasu and Shulu, the biblical Midianites, Kenites, and Amalekites, as well as displaced peasants and pastoralists. They seem to be kind of an inferior social class of outlaws, mercenaries, and slaves leading a marginal and kind of lawless existence on the fringes of society. But with that said, there could be some connection between the emergence of the people group Israel and the Habiru social class, but to say that the Habiru are the Hebrews would be incorrect. You can maybe get away with saying something like all Hebrews are Habiru, but not all Habiru are Hebrews. But nevertheless, they are different groups of people. So back to the Exodus. There are reports of Egyptians pursuing runaway slaves, but nothing to the extent of what the Bible claims. So you would have the Egyptian military essentially chasing down close to 1 million people. And there's just nothing like that, even remotely close to that kind of a situation recorded in ancient history outside of the Bible. So really, there's only at best circumstantial evidence when we're looking at the late date for the Exodus. But if there is any historical basis whatsoever to the Exodus, the general consensus is that it would have taken place during this time period. So we're looking at still the late date. And I'll get into why that is more a little later. But if there is any kind of historical validity, the situation would just be much less dramatic on a much smaller scale than what the biblical story talks about, just because there is such a lack of evidence for the biblical account, and it's pretty clear that the story is embellished. And not to mention, there are no Egyptian historical accounts of plagues or the loss of 1 to 2 million slaves. There's no evidence of a population of that size having ever wandered through the desert of Sinai, and there are no neighboring nations that speak of any of these events of the plagues or the Exodus. You would expect that if something of this magnitude occurred, that somebody would have written about it. But again, you just don't have anything like that. So that brings us to the early date for the Exodus. And the early date is 1446 BCE. And where this date comes from, when we look at 1 Kings 6:1, it reads, "Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So the date Solomon began building the temple is well established as 967 BCE, and so simple addition places the Exodus at 1446 BCE and the Conquest at 1406 BCE. And so with this date, the Exodus occurs during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which is the period of 1549 through 12 92 BCE, and also starts the first dynasty of the New Kingdom. 18th dynasty and New Kingdom is Ahmose the First, 1549 through 1523 BCE was his reign, and he was succeeded by Amenhotep the First, 1525 through 1504 BCE, Thutmose the First, 1506 through 1493 BCE, Thutmose II, 1493 through 1479 BCE, Hatshepsut, 1479 through 1458 BCE, and Thutmose III, 1458 through 1425 BCE. And so, looking at this date of the Exodus, Pharaoh Thutmose III would be the pharaoh during the Exodus event. And interestingly enough, Thutmose III was succeeded by his second-born son, Amenhotep II, because his first son, Amenemhat, had died. Now, if you are familiar with the Exodus story, I'm not going to get into the narrative, but in the last plague, the 10th plague, the angel of death goes out over the land of Egypt and kills the firstborn son of every household. And in the Bible, it's recorded that the Pharaoh's firstborn son dies. So there's a bit of coincidence for you. It's interesting, and so I leave it up to you what you want to do with that information. But moving on from there. Another interesting parallel with this dynasty is the name Mos that is present with a lot of these names. And Mos in Egypt meant son of, so Ahmose, for example, meant the son of Ah, or Thutmose meant the son of Tut. So it's also interesting then that Moses would have this Egyptian name, having been adopted into the family. And you might ask yourself, well, why would that be the case if the story is made up, isn't true? And I don't really have a good answer for that. Maybe he was given this name by the people who wrote this story as a way to kind of corroborate the narrative, to make it a cohesive story. But this chronology of the 18th dynasty places Jacob, who was the last patriarch, son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. So Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. And Jacob, according to the biblical narrative, was named Israel because God changed his name to Israel because he wrestled with God. We'll talk about that in the next video. But anyway, Jacob is in Egypt by 1876 BCE, and we have Joseph's death 1816 BCE, according to the biblical time frame of the 430 years of slavery. We have Moses' birth would be around 1525 BCE, based on the reading we get from Exodus 7:7. The Exodus then is at 1446 BCE. The Conquest is at 1406 BCE. So hold that thought there for a minute. I'm going to introduce a popular topic into this whole mix of ideas, and that being the topic of the Hyksos. So, roughly 1630 BCE, Egypt was invaded and conquered by a group of Semitic people known as the Hyksos, and they established the 15th dynasty of Egypt and set themselves up in the land of Goshen. The theory behind the Hyksos and the Israelites is that the Hyksos, being Semitic, would have been empathetic toward Joseph and his family because they were also Semitic, and this would have allowed for his family to rise to prominence in Egypt. And then it also would account for the part in the biblical story where it says that a new pharaoh came who did not know Joseph or the Israelites and sold them into slavery. And so that kind of fits with the historical account of the Hyksos and then Ahmose the First coming onto the scene, because Ahmose the First eventually defeated the Hyksos and initiated his reign 1549 BCE. And so if Joseph and his family were prominent figures and had significant roles in Egypt under the Hyksos, by the time Ahmose the First overthrew the Hyksos and established rule over Egypt, he wouldn't have cared about Joseph or the Israelites or the history that was there with them, so it would make sense that he would just enslave them. However, there is an issue of dating with this theory. So Jacob went to Egypt when he was 130 years old, and he dies 17 years later. And so presumably Jacob dies around 1885. And then Joseph died at the age of 110 years old, so let's say he died around 1865 BCE. And the Hyksos weren't on the scene until 1630 BCE, so that's a significant gap of time there for the Hyksos theory to work with this early date. Also, in the Bible, it says that Joseph's new wife is said to be the daughter of Potiphar, which was the priest of On. And On was the center of solar worship for the ancient Egyptians. And the Hyksos exclusively worship Set, not On. That's a small discrepancy, but a discrepancy nonetheless. So really with all that, if you are to accept the early date, or the late date for that matter, you can't have Joseph in Egypt in the period of the Hyksos. So with all of this said, the consensus by and large is for the late date of 1265 BCE under Ramses II. And this is largely because of what we read in Exodus 1:11 and 12:37, which mentions that the Israelites built storehouses in the towns of Pithom and Ramses. And it's interesting to note, too, that the pharaoh Merneptah succeeded Ramses II, and it is on Merneptah's stela that we find the first historical mention of an Israelite people. And though the late date is the general consensus, many really are just abandoning the Exodus altogether. They're not going from the late date to the early date, or vice versa. They're just scrapping the whole thing because of the lack of evidence for it. But with that said, you do still have that faithful remnant of your more conservative biblical scholars who hold to a literal interpretation of Scripture, and they by and large reject the late date for the Exodus and promote the early date. So eventually, Pharaoh listens to Moses and lets the Israelites go. You know how the story goes. And the book of Numbers gives a list of sites that the Hebrews allegedly settle in Sinai and its immediate surroundings during the Exodus. And of these sites, though, a select few can be pinpointed relatively well based on their description. And two sites that can be pinpointed fairly well are Kadesh Barnea, which is modern En Kadesh, and Ezion Geber, which are on the Israeli side of the border between Israel and Jordan, just outside of Elat. And both sites have been investigated archaeologically and appear to have been founded during the ancient Near Eastern Late Iron Age, so no earlier than 700-800 BCE. So that date clearly does not line up with either the early date or the late date for the Exodus. But with that, many, if not most, of the places mentioned in the Exodus did not exist within the same chronological period as one another. Pithom and Ramses, the two major cities claimed to have been built by the Hebrews, never actually existed at the same time. So Pithom did not exist as a significant settlement before the 26th dynasty, so that's 664 through 525 BCE. And the city of Ramses was built in the 13th century BCE and abandoned around 1060 BCE. And another example of this is the Exodus portrayal of Edom. And Edom was not yet a nation. The places that the Hebrews stop, that the Bible refers to as Edom, wasn't even built until 800 BCE. And so all of this said to me was that the Egyptians had a history of Asiatic and Semitic people from the Levant coming and going for various reasons throughout their history. And while this is true, there is no evidence of a distinctly Semitic group referred to as the Israelites in Egypt at any time. The consensus view among Egyptologists say that the Exodus is essentially a non-issue and that there is no point in really discussing it because there simply is no archaeological or anthropological evidence for it. And there are some, though, who believe that there are more or less historical kernels of facts found in the biblical narrative that reflect various points of Egyptian history and its interactions with the Semitic neighbors. And these neighbors would have lived in Egypt either as slaves or immigrants or refugees or workers, and would have had both positive and negative experiences, and then they would have remembered these experiences and passed these stories down to descendants, and perhaps their descendants in these stories about what it was like living in Egypt found their way back to the Levant and were shared with one another and with other people who maybe had interactions with the Egyptians as well. And so really what it would come down to is that the biblical narrative is this amalgamation of memories and stories of people from the Levant in Egypt. So for example, maybe multiple stories about Hyksos characters were turned into one figure they called Joseph, or one figure that they called Moses. And these stories were consolidated to create a cultural memory and formed an identity that would become the Israelite culture, and that culture began to homogenize and grow from there. Okay, so this brings us to Joshua and Israel's conquest. When looking into the conquest of Canaan, the question that must be asked is whether or not the archaeological and textual evidence clearly supports or refutes the ancient narratives of the Israelite conquest that are primarily found in the books of Joshua and Judges. I will say at the outset that there is more archaeological and extra-biblical evidence of Canaanite conquest in favor of the early date of the Exodus. So if we ascribe to the early date of 1446 BCE for the Exodus, minus the 40 years of wandering, that places the conquest at 1406 BCE. Now, with that said, so Egypt had imperial control of Canaan in Syria from 1500 to 1200 BCE, but except for the Merneptah Stela, there is no reference to Israel or any of the tribes of Israel. But this silence by itself is not decisive in saying that the Israelite conquest of Canaan did not happen. But when we couple the silence in the textual historical record with the absence of any kind of reference to Egyptian military activity against Israel in the books of Joshua and Judges, the silence again becomes a problem for the belief that Israel could fight against Egyptian interests in Canaan without evoking an Egyptian response. And then the military activities of the Judges, there again, this is predominantly during the time of Egyptian rule over Canaan. This is an issue because the belief that Israel could seize power, raze major cities to the ground, and wage war on Egyptian territory without evoking an Egyptian response really just doesn't add up. And kind of along those same lines, when you consider all the nations who oppressed Israel in the book of Judges, and we find the enemies to include a long list of people from Mesopotamia, Moab, Philistines, Canaanites, Hazor, the Midianites, Ishmaelites, Amorites, but Egypt is never mentioned as an oppressor of Israel, and that's strange, again, for the reasons I've already mentioned. And you would expect at least a mention of Merneptah's campaign in Canaan around that 1200 BCE time frame, because according to the chronology and the biblical narrative, the time of the Judges would line up with Pharaoh Merneptah. But again, you have no reference to any kind of conflict with Pharaoh Merneptah in that period. But nevertheless, biblical scholars do still hold to a literal reading and still say that the Israelite conquest of Canaan, as it is stated in the book of Joshua, absolutely happened in the exact way that it's written down. And they believe that this is able to be more or less proven archaeologically. And so when we're talking about archaeology around the Canaanite conquest, we really are looking at three major cities. And those cities are Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And so starting with the city of Jericho, initial excavations at the site of Jericho yielded little to no support for a major settlement or mass destruction of the city in the 13th century. But an updated and comprehensive analysis of both local and exotic pottery, artifacts, walls, and radiocarbon dating, a reasonable and compelling case was made that suggested that the account of the conquest of Jericho is supported archaeologically, and archaeological evidence points to the destruction taking place in the stratum known as Jericho 4C. In this layer of the city of Jericho, Egyptian scarabs were found to be present in the city, and that is a strong argument for inhabitation at the city during this time period, and then you don't find anything like that after the 1400 BCE date. Also, there was a discovery of a burned layer in that Jericho 4C layer, which shows quick and intentional burning, and it proves that the city was intentionally destroyed by fire, and that lines up with the biblical narrative. There are also small details that are in the biblical text that match archaeological findings from this layer, such as walls falling outward and forming a ramp rather than inward, and there was no plundering of the city's grain stores. The houses were built up against the wall, and the destruction of the city occurred soon after harvest. So what do we do with that information? One could say, see, this proves the Bible to be completely reliable and historically valid in every way. And before my deconstruction process, that would have been the mentality I would have had, right? At this point in my process, I knew that that wasn't true, right? So there had to be another explanation for this archaeological discovery, right? So without reading the archaeological findings into the biblical narrative, really all that you can conclude is that these findings indicate that Jericho was inhabited during this time period, was destroyed around 1400 BCE, and this destruction correlates with the early conquest date, and the details of the destruction correlate with the details in the biblical narrative, but however, correlation does not mean causation, right? And also, it's just really easy to connect dots that have no connection, and what I mean by that is, so this evidence is speaking only to the city of Jericho in this time period, and it says nothing about the Exodus story. It says nothing about the wandering in the desert, right? And it doesn't suddenly make all of those issues that were discussed before this point go away, right? So there again, it's about reading the evidence as it is objectively. It only means what it says. It doesn't mean anything other than what it says. And so that's really hard to do. And in my initial stages of deconstruction, it was really hard for me to keep myself from doing that because I was really, really good at connecting dots that really didn't have any actual connection to them. So with that, moving on to the city of Ai, the large mound of Khirbet et Tel, commonly identified as Ai, was excavated in the 1960s, and it shows no evidence of occupation or destruction at the time of the conquest, so many scholars have rejected the basic historicity of the account in Joshua 7 through 8, which talks about the destruction of Ai. The problem is that now it's believed they were looking in the wrong place. So the narrative of Joshua 7 through 8 provides a number of topographical and geographical details that narrow any potential candidate for the city of Ai. And there are several specific criteria that must be satisfied for a site to be identified with this city. It needs to have fortification walls. It has to have a main gate facing north. Has to be relatively small in size, has to have evidence of the presence of women, evidence of occupation during the 15th century BCE, and evidence of destruction by fire in the 15th century BCE. And the Associates for Biblical Research has conducted archaeological excavations at a nearby site, Khirbet el Makatir, since 1995, uncovering significant evidence to establish this as the site of Ai, and this includes pottery evidence from the late 15th century BCE, evidence of a fire, a shallow valley north of Ai, which would have been a viable location for Joshua's ambushing forces. And in 2013, they discovered a rare Egyptian scarab that can be dated to the 15th century BCE. So here we have a lot of evidence for a 15th century destruction of a city that parallels with the biblical narrative. And finally, the city of Hatzor. The ancient city of Hatzor is located at Tel Hatzor, also called Tel El-Qeda, northwest of the Sea of Galilee. And the city is located on the southwestern edge of the Hula Valley, and in ancient times it was situated south of the city of Kadesh and controlled a major trade route of the ancient Near East. Hazor is the largest archaeological site in Israel and was appropriately referred to in Joshua 11:10 as the head of all of these kingdoms. And two significant destruction of Hazor has been discovered. The first was a destruction by fire that's dated to 15th century BCE, and the second has been dated to the mid-20th century BCE. And this is significant because the city of Hazor was actually the target of two separate Israelite attacks, according to the Bible. The first was under the leadership of Joshua, which in this case would have been 15th century BCE, and then the second was under the leadership of Deborah and Barak in 13th century BCE. And at least as far as the 13th century BCE destruction goes, it appears that the Israelites are a prime candidate for this. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen agrees that the Egyptians, Canaanites, and the sea peoples, such as the Philistines, are not candidates for the people who destroyed the city at this time, and says that the Israelites are a viable candidate for this. Now, with all of this said, there is one issue that we find with the extra-biblical evidence in the Israelite narrative of the Conquest, and that's found in the Amarna letters. So, the Amarna letters were clay tablets primarily consisting of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian administration and its representatives in Canaan and its other neighboring kingdom leaders. And these letters date from around 1390 to 1330 BCE. And there are letters written to the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten that give us reason for rejecting the view that Joshua destroyed Hazor around 1400 BCE. Because we learn that Hazor at this time was a thriving city during this period. In the letters it reads that Abdi Tishri, the king of Hazor, declares his fidelity to Pharaoh and indicates that he is protecting Egyptian interests in the region and specifically refers to Hazor as being your city. In another letter, the ruler Ayab complains to Pharaoh that the king of Hazor has taken 3 cities from me. And then one written by Abi Milku, the king of Tyre, reports to Pharaoh that the king of Hazor has aligned himself with the Abiru. And all of this information from the Amarna correspondence demonstrates that Hazor was a major player in the region, and from the sounds of it, does not sound like it was a city that had just been demolished and burnt by Joshua and the Israelites. The Amarna letters make no reference to Joshua or the Israelites, and so that's an issue that we're faced with if we're trying to take the biblical narrative seriously. So here again, what do we make with all of this information? Clearly there was a significant amount of conflict in Canaan during the 14th century BCE, and the superpower at this time was arguably the Egyptians, who were in control of the land of Canaan. And though there are clear parallels between this period and the biblical narrative of the conquest of Canaan, there really is no indication that it was for certain the Israelite people who were attacking these cities. And to say otherwise is really speculation, because it can't be corroborated extra-biblically. And kind of the way that I looked at it then and see it now is that if there was a people group as large and as homogeneous, as organized as the Israelites roaming Canaan and attacking cities, you would think that someone would have been talking about it and referring to this group of people as Israel, but that isn't the case, and you don't have the Israelites mentioned in records like the Amarna letters, for example. So this raises the question, where did the Israelites come from, right? So there are 3 theories of how the Israelites came to be, and those are the peaceful infiltration theory, the gradual emergence theory, and the peasant uprising theory. So the peaceful infiltration theory essentially is an immigration model, and it says that the people group who would become known as the Israelites entered the land of Canaan gradually from the Transjordan in the east and Kadesh Barnea in the south, settling in the sparsely populated areas of the Central Highlands. And this mimics the idea of the biblical account that the Israelites came into a land that was not theirs and possessed it. This, however, does not include any fighting, but instead postulates that they entered the land and began settling in areas that either weren't populated or just areas that nobody else really wanted. Hebrew settlement could have taken advantage of upheavals and mass migrations by entering and occupying major cities in the central highlands of Canaan. And there are several sites in this region that are newer in their origin, but the pottery and houses themselves are entirely Canaanite, suggesting that the settlements were established peacefully rather than by conquest. And so a theory within this model is that the Israelites were kind of a wandering semi-nomadic clan who peacefully entered the land and settled in the hill country, which was unoccupied, and they were joined by Yahweh worshippers from the desert, and they all kind of band together in Canaan. And in this process, as they're all coming in from these different areas, they adopt the native material and culture of the land of Canaan, and they eventually grow strong enough to organize and gain dominance in the rest of the land, and they eventually call themselves Israel. So that's one idea. Then there's the gradual emergence, and this theory is a Canaanite origins theory, and this really says that as people were coming into the heavily populated coastal plains and heavily populated by the Egyptians, who had been there for quite a long time, and then the sea peoples having arrived, such as the Philistines. And in this theory, the Israelites were essentially Canaanites who developed a separate identity and withdrew from the coastal and plain regions and moved eastward into the less populated highlands. And then there, perhaps they came across the Yahweh cult, which was introduced by escaping slaves from Egypt or from nomads in the Sinai desert. And then, kind of like the peaceful infiltration theory, they came together and began to develop a unique culture and identity in that place. And, it's interesting with these first two theories. We read in scripture where it says that Yahweh revealed a wise strategy commanding Israel to take over the existing infrastructure in Canaan instead of destroying it. When the Lord your God has cut off the nations whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them and dwell in their cities and in their houses. That's Deuteronomy 19:1. And then in Joshua 24:13 it reads, I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them. You eat of the vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. So these verses actually bolster these first two theories, right? And then finally we have the peasant uprising theory. And this essentially says that the Canaanites rose up against their overlords as a sort of social revolution. And then there are letters like the Amarna letters sent to Egypt by Canaanite rulers saying that there are groups in the area challenging Egypt's rule and causing issues in Canaan. And they reference the Hebiru as being among the groups that are causing trouble. And so a theory is that the escaping Semites joined with this Hebiru group to overthrow the rulers in Canaan and establish their new culture, their new identity, and eventually their new gods and religion. So really, to summarize all of this, when we look at the biblical narrative in light of archaeological, historical, textual evidence, the Israelites were the only ones writing this story that we find in the Bible. No other nations are writing about an Exodus, this massive group of about 1 million people wandering in the desert for 40 years, the conquest of Canaan by this group of people known as Israel. The only people who are saying this happened are the people who eventually came out on top in the land of Canaan. You might say that this is history written by the victors. And when you see the archaeological evidence of destruction of Canaanite cities around this 1400 BCE date, it is just as likely, if not more likely, that it reveals sort of a combination of the people coming in from the outside and joining with these other groups that are in conflict with Canaanite cities, as well as just some of the peaceful infiltration into the central highlands of Canaan. And over time, these people come together and they begin to form a cohesive group and begin to form a narrative, begin to form an identity, and they eventually call themselves Israel. And if they arrived in 1400 BCE, they possibly fought a few battles and maybe banded together with other local Canaanites and maybe some of these groups of people that were called the Hebiru, and then just happened to come out on top. And so there they would have had about 400 years to establish a cultural narrative, a history, religion, and their own unique identity. And this is more than enough time for a group of people to intermingle and come together, and some native Canaan, some outsiders, and adopt a lot of the culture of the place that they were living, as well as bring in some of their own culture from places that they would have come from, and from there began to write their story, or at least began to pass down their story orally. And so at this point, it was evident that the biblical account of Israel was not to be taken as historically accurate or literally. And this really just reinforced for me that the Bible was not the authority that I thought it was, that it's full of contradictions, but then also that it just gets things wrong. This, of course, doesn't discredit any of the wisdom that you find in any of the philosophical, more humanistic kind of truths that you find in the Bible. But as a whole, when it comes to Israelite history, it is safe to assume that we need to take these accounts with a grain of salt and not read them literally. And there are a lot of people who kind of stop here, right? They say, yeah, the Bible can't be read literally. It's probably not infallible. It's probably, gets a lot of things historically wrong, but they still maintain their faith. They still maintain their religion. They just might be a bit more liberal, progressive. And I kind of hung out in that space for a little bit, but it just didn't sit well with me. And I knew that I had to keep looking further into these things. And so I continued to pull on that loose thread, and I started looking into the origin of the Judeo-Christian God and the composition of the Old Testament as a whole. And so that's what the next video is going to cover. I'll be talking about my research into the origins of the biblical God, Yahweh, and a bit about the composition of the Old Testament. So with that said, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.